At Christmas dinner that year, I sat at the far end of my son's long oak table, the one he and his wife insisted on buying when they moved into their Cedar Grove house. The lights were warm. The smell of roasted ham and cinnamon cider drifted softly through the room, and everyone was dressed in their brightest holiday colors. It should have felt comforting, familiar, the kind of night a mother looks forward to all year. But something in the air was tight, stretched, almost trembling, like the silence before a storm. I could feel the distance between me and everyone else, even though they were only a few feet away. It was the kind of emotional distance that builds slowly, silently, until suddenly you realize you are sitting at the same table, but no longer part of the same world. Natalie stood up first. She always did things first these days. Her peach-colored dress shimmered under the light, hugging her body like she was stepping onto a stage rather than into a family gathering. She lifted her glass high, smiling that confident smile she had perfected since the day she married my son, a smile that held victory more than warmth. "Family," she said, her voice louder than necessary. "I have an announcement." The room quieted, forks lowered. Even the Christmas music playing softly in the background seemed to fade. I watched Jacob, my son, sitting beside her, 32 years old, still with that boyish warmth in his eyes, but now slightly shadowed by something he didn't recognize, something he didn't know was taking shape around him. He looked up at her with admiration, unaware of what was coming, or maybe unwilling to see it. Natalie raised her glass a little higher and smiled directly at me. My heart tightened just enough for me to notice. "Starting today, I will be managing the finances for this family." A few cousins exchanged amused glances. One of Jacob's aunts let out a small, approving laugh. She continued speaking, each word landing on the table like a pebble tossed into a silent pond. "Evelyn's credit card is no longer active. We canceled it this morning. It's better for her. She doesn't need the stress of managing money at her age. If she needs anything, Jacob and I are here. She just has to ask in advance." There were small gasps, but not of outrage. They were soft, surprised, but leaning toward agreement. Someone even murmured something about older women being better off without financial responsibility. Another lifted their glass toward Natalie in approval. I simply sat still. My hands did not shake. My breath stayed even. Inside, something old and familiar stirred. Not anger, not surprise, just a quiet acknowledgement of a line finally crossed. Jacob reached for my hand, his face soft with concern. "Mom, it's really better this way. You don't have to worry about bills anymore. Let us help you." He meant it. He believed it. And that was the part that stabbed deeper than anything Natalie had said. I withdrew my hand gently. He didn't notice the small twitch of pain in my expression. Natalie looked around the table like a queen surveying her audience and added another blow. "Let's toast to this new chapter, to responsibility, to family, to doing things the right way." Glasses clinked, smiles spread. I sat as they celebrated what they believed was my defeat, my humiliation. I watched these faces. Many I had fed, held, supported through years of holiday dinners, now nodding as if stripping me of independence was an act of kindness. Natalie remained standing, waiting for me to react. Maybe she thought I would cry. Maybe she expected me to get angry or plead. She wanted drama. She wanted a spectacle, something to prove that her decision had weight, that she had power. It was quiet enough to hear the wind brushing the windows. I reached for my glass. I didn't drink. I simply placed it back on the table with a soft thud. It was nothing more than glass meeting wood, but the sound echoed louder than I anticipated. Conversation stopped. Heads turned toward me. Even Natalie's confident smile faltered. I slowly stood up, careful with my knees, which had begun to stiffen more frequently these days. The room felt colder somehow, like the warmth of the candles had faded. I looked at my son first, my sweet boy, who had grown into a man but still carried that gentle innocence that made me protect him more fiercely than anything else in the world. He met my eyes with confusion, worry, something else I could not name. I smiled, not a bitter smile, not a sad one, but the kind of smile that comes when you finally see the truth clearly and accept it for what it is. A calm, almost peaceful smile, one that held more power than any raised voice. "Jacob," I said softly, "you truly don't know, do you?" His eyebrows drew together. He blinked, as if trying to read a hidden meaning. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Natalie stepped forward quickly, her voice sharp and tight. "Know what?" She tried to laugh, but it cracked at the end. "What exactly is she talking about, Jacob?" The room was silent again, completely silent. Only the ticking of the clock on the wall punctured the stillness. I didn't answer. Not yet. I let the silence hold them, let the unease settle, let the cracks form in the story Natalie had carefully crafted. Jacob looked at me again, this time with something that resembled fear, or maybe realization, maybe the beginning of doubt. I looked around the room one more time, letting my eyes fall on each person who had just cheered for my supposed downfall. And finally, I turned back to Jacob. "The truth," I said quietly, "is something you've never needed to know, not until tonight." Natalie's breath hitched, a faint, involuntary sound. She knew something had shifted, but couldn't understand how or why. Before anyone could speak, before the tension could spill over, a knock sounded at the front door. Not loud, not urgent, just a single calm knock. Jacob looked toward the sound. Natalie froze. And I simply kept standing there, letting the moment settle like dust in the light. It was the perfect time to stop pretending, the perfect time to stop waiting, and the perfect time to reveal what they had all been so certain didn't exist. The knock at the door felt like it traveled straight through my chest, but I kept my eyes on Jacob as he turned away from me. He hesitated for a moment, glancing back as if torn between answering the door and staying rooted in whatever truth he sensed was coming. Eventually he walked off, leaving me standing under the dim chandelier with a room full of people pretending not to stare directly at me. While Jacob stepped away, I let my breathing settle. The tension in the room thickened, but I welcomed it. I had lived far too many years swallowing my words, shrinking myself down so others could feel comfortable. I would not shrink tonight. I heard Jacob at the front door speaking quietly to someone. I could not quite catch the words, but the tone was polite, uncertain. A moment later he returned, saying that someone had dropped off a small package addressed to me. He set it at my place on the table, still wrapped in thick brown paper. Natalie eyed it like it might explode. I did not reach for it. Instead, I slowly sat back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. The package could wait. There was a longer story behind it, one I had not planned to reveal here, at this table, under these cheap string lights and judgmental gazes. But life rarely offers perfect timing. It only offers moments. And this was one of mine. Jacob sat down again, nervously tapping his fingers on his knee. His face held the same puzzled, childlike expression he wore when he was 8 years old, and asked why other kids had fathers who picked them up from school while his mother worked late hemming dresses. I looked at him now and felt that old mix of love and guilt, the same combination that had carried me through the hardest years of my life. Back then, it was just the two of us in a tiny rental in East Portland. I can still feel the cold drafts coming through the loose window frames, the chipped tile floors, the shared laundry room that always smelled like bleach and cigarettes. I worked every hour I could at a small alteration shop, sewing hems for bridesmaids who didn't know my name and patching jeans for teenagers who barely made eye contact. It was honest work, though, and it paid enough to keep Jacob warm and fed. I never told anyone how many nights I cried quietly at the kitchen table, staring at overdue bills under the dim light of a thrift store lamp. Widowhood was not gentle to me. James passed away suddenly, leaving nothing but debts and a son who looked too much like him. Jacob's little hands would curl around my arm at night, and I would lie awake wondering how a woman barely holding herself together could possibly raise a child alone. One winter afternoon in 1999, the pipes burst under the sink. Water flew everywhere, soaking my only decent pair of shoes. I fell to my knees with a wrench in my hand and just stayed there, water rushing around me, my hands shaking as I tried to fix something I had no idea how to fix. That was the moment I realized no one was coming to save me. Not family, not friends, not fate, not... But in that moment, as humiliating as it was, something in me hardened, or maybe awakened. I decided two things that day. I would not drown, and Jacob would never feel the fear I felt kneeling on that cold floor. So I worked harder, learned more, took extra jobs at night, saved every dollar I could, not in a jar or a drawer like some people did, but in small certificates of deposit at the local credit union. It was only a few $100s at first, then a few thousand, enough to fix old cars, enough to pay for Jacob's school clothes, enough to keep the lights on even in the worst months. And then, when I least expected it, life handed me a small miracle. It came in the form of a woman named Mrs. Bennett, a wealthy widow who came into the shop one afternoon with a vintage silk dress that needed restoring. She watched me work, watched my hands move through fabric like it was a conversation, and told me I had talent worth far more than what I was charging. She introduced me to two of her friends in the real estate business, women who believed in investing wisely rather than spending carelessly. They taught me how to buy small fixer homes, how to rent them out, how to reinvest the profits. They never talked down to me, never treated me as fragile or less capable. They saw a woman trying to survive and offered her the dignity of empowerment. Over the years, my life grew slowly but steadily. Not the loud kind of growth that gets attention, the quiet kind that stays invisible unless someone bothers to look. And no one in that room tonight had ever bothered to look. Across the table, Natalie shifted in her seat, breaking the memory. She crossed her arms, the defensiveness barely hidden behind her calm facade. She looked irritated, like she hadn't expected me to turn this moment into anything other than a tearful collapse. Her voice cut through the room. "Evelyn, this is getting dramatic. Maybe we should just move on with dinner." Her tone was sweet, too sweet, but her eyes were hard. She wanted control back. She wanted the room back. She wanted my silence. Jacob looked between us, clearly unsettled. "Mom, do you want to sit down for a bit?" He spoke softly, gently, as if I was fragile, as if I might break. He had no idea how many times life had knocked me down, and how many times I had risen without a hand to help me. I placed my napkin on the table. My voice was steady, steady in a way that made Natalie blink. "Jacob, you have always believed the world is kinder than it is. I never wanted to take that belief from you. I never wanted to tell you how hard things were when you were a boy. You only saw the part I wanted you to see, the part where I cooked dinner on time, even if I had skipped my own lunch. The part where I cheered for your school concerts, even if my hands were raw from sewing all day. The part where I smiled at you, even when I was terrified." Natalie let out a small laugh, a nervous one. "Is this really necessary?" I kept my eyes on Jacob. He was breathing shallowly, waiting for something, though he didn't know what. I spoke again, my voice lower now. "You think you know me, But there is so much you never learned about my life, so much you never needed to know before now. The room was still. Even the candles seemed to hold their flame differently. I rested my hand lightly on the package Jacob had placed in front of me, not opening it yet, just letting it sit there like a promise of what was coming. And for the first time that evening, I was not the one who looked uncertain. It was Natalie. Her hands gripped the back of her chair. Her smile faltered. Her eyes kept darting to the package, then to me, then to Jacob. She sensed the shift, even if she did not understand it. Before anyone could ask anything more, I leaned back slightly and breathed in the heavy air of that dining room. I knew this night was far from over, and I knew that the truth I had protected for decades was about to surface, whether they were ready for it or not. Jacob watched me closely, his eyes unsure, his shoulders tense, as if he sensed a weight settling into the room that he could not yet name. I could feel Natalie staring too, her gaze sharp and restless, the way a person looks when they know something is slipping out of their control. The candles flickered along the table, throwing soft light across a room full of people who suddenly felt like strangers. I let the moment breathe, not to be dramatic, but because the past has its own pace when it returns, and mine was already rising in my chest like a tide I could no longer hold back. None of you ever asked how Jacob and I managed after James died. I let my voice remain steady, not loud, but clear enough that no one could pretend they had not heard. And I suppose I understand that. I never volunteered much either. There are years you simply survive and move on from, not because they did not matter, but because speaking them aloud makes them too real again. Jacob shifted in his chair, his jaw tensing. Mom, you never had to explain anything. You always made everything seem fine. I nodded. That was the point. I did not want you to grow up with the fear I woke up with every morning back then. Money fear, safety fear, not knowing if our car would start or if the landlord would raise rent again. I wanted you to feel secure, even when I did not. A few faces at the table softened, the judgment fading for a moment, but Natalie remained stiff, unmoved, her polished nails tapping against her wine glass in a restless rhythm. I let my eyes drift toward her for just a second. The strength she wore so loudly had always felt hollow to me, like something built on borrowed pieces. She noticed my glance and lifted her chin as if daring me to continue. And so I did. I met Natalie the afternoon Jacob brought her home. I remember thinking she was beautiful and bright and confident. She filled the doorway like someone who had always belonged in the center of every room, the kind of woman people follow without questioning why. Natalie gave a tight smile across the table. I am going to assume that is a compliment. It is an observation, I replied softly. Jacob looked confused again, his hands clasping together on the table. He had no idea where this was going, and I could see the worry building in him. I continued. When she walked into my house that first day, she had the kind of presence that makes a mother pause, not in fear, in awareness. I felt something the second I shook her hand, a calculation behind the friendliness, a hunger behind the compliments, a sharpness behind her charm. Natalie scoffed quietly and turned away as if the conversation was beneath her. But Jacob smiled at her that day with a softness I had not seen in him since he was in college, a pure kind of happiness. And because I loved him, I set my worry aside. I glanced down at my hands, remembering that evening more vividly than I expected. The casserole cooling on the counter, the thrifted curtains fluttering in the draft, the way Jacob hovered proudly beside her, as if he had finally found someone who made him feel seen in a way he had longed for. He had always been gentle, easily moved, easily hopeful, and people like Natalie, who know exactly how to play into someone's longing, have a way of slipping in through the parts of them that feel unfinished. The first sign was small, a tiny comment from Natalie about my neighborhood not being safe enough for someone my age, a suggestion that I should let Jacob help with my bills, a joke about me keeping track of my finances in notebooks instead of apps. I brushed it all aside. Little cuts are easy to ignore until they begin to sting in the same place. One evening at Jacob's apartment, she asked about my house almost casually, as if it were an afterthought. How big it was, how old, whether I lived alone, whether I had considered downsizing, whether I had a will prepared. Each question wrapped in a friendly tone, but her eyes told the truth. She had already begun looking past who I was and right into what I had. Natalie leaned forward now, her voice sharp. You are twisting things. I was being thoughtful. You always seemed overwhelmed. I smiled faintly. I know what overwhelmed looks like. I have lived it. What you did was not concern. It was inventory. Jacob inhaled sharply, but he did not interrupt. He looked between us like someone watching two threads of a story finally tie together in the place he feared they would. Over time, I noticed how Jacob changed. He called less. He came by less. He began saying things I had never once heard from him, things about boundaries and generational dysfunction and responsibility, phrases that did not sound like him at all. They sounded like someone else speaking through him. Natalie laughed, but it was thin now, cracking at the edges. People grow up. Evelyn, that is normal. Maybe you did not want to accept that. I kept my gaze steady. Growth does not require erasing the person who raised you. The room shifted again, quiet but heavy. Most everyone kept their eyes on their plates, unwilling to insert themselves into a tension too delicate to touch. She inserted herself into Jacob's life quickly and completely. I said it slowly, deliberately, and in return, he pushed me gently out of the center of his. That is how relationships work. I accepted that much. What I did not accept was the way she spoke to me when Jacob was not in the room. Natalie froze. She told me I needed to stop being a burden, that I should be grateful she was willing to guide Jacob through life in ways I had clearly failed to, that she was going to make sure our family stepped into a modern, structured lifestyle, and that my ways were outdated and inconvenient. Jacob looked horrified. Natalie, did you say that? Natalie opened her mouth, but the truth was already written across her face. I continued softly. I did not tell him, because I thought foolishly that she would soften with time. But people do not soften when they believe themselves already superior. They sharpen. I drew a breath and let my gaze settle on the package still sitting unopened beside me. By the time I realized what she wanted from your life, it was no longer about whether she liked me. It was about protecting you from something you could not see for yourself. Jacob rose slowly from his chair, his face pale. Mom, what did she want? I let the question hang for a moment, letting the truth ripple quietly toward him. Before I could answer, the front door creaked again. Someone stepped past the threshold, hesitating in the entryway. The murmur of voices in the dining room hushed instantly. Even Natalie went still. Jacob turned, expecting a guest who had arrived late. But it was not a guest. It was someone who had been waiting for the right moment to walk into this story, and the moment had just arrived. Jacob stared at the figure in the entryway for a long second before he seemed to recognize her shape. It was only Mrs. Berman, my neighbor, bundled in her thick winter coat with snow tangled in her hair. She pressed her hands together as if embarrassed to interrupt. The front door closed behind her with a soft click. The room, already tense, seemed to pull tighter around us. I rose slowly from my chair. My knees throbbed, but I ignored the pain. Mrs. Berman offered me a trembling smile. then looked toward Jacob with something like apology. I hope I am not intruding. I was passing by and saw a package on your porch. I thought Evelyn might need it. Her eyes flicked toward the brown parcel on the table, and then toward Natalie, though she tried to hide it. Natalie stiffened, clearly irritated that someone she considered unimportant had dared step into her perfectly crafted evening. Jacob gestured awkwardly and said he would take her coat, but she shook her head. She kept her boots on, as if she planned to leave quickly. Her presence alone shifted the room. She was not part of this family. She had no reason to lie for or protect anyone here, and that made her dangerous to Natalie. I walked toward her and placed a gentle hand on her arm. Thank you for bringing it in. You did not need to, but I appreciate it. She leaned in a little, lowering her voice to a whisper that still carried through the quiet room. I thought you might want to know. She paused, gathering her courage. Earlier today, I heard Natalie talking on the phone outside. She said something about assisted living and getting it done after the holidays. I wanted to bring you the package myself because I worried she was planning something that would hurt you. A ripple of shock traveled across the table. Natalie opened her mouth, then shut it again, her expression flattening into something cold and rigid. Jacob looked at her sharply, his confusion shifting into disbelief. The cousins glanced at one another, unsure where to look. Natalie stepped forward, speaking too quickly. She is confused. I never said anything like that. People mishear things. It was probably about someone else. Maybe she misunderstood. Her voice trembled at the end, betraying the calm she tried to project. Mrs. Berman only looked at her with a sad patience, the kind older women keep for children who insist that the cookie jar broke itself. Jacob stared at Natalie, waiting for some explanation. She avoided his eyes. I thanked Mrs. Berman once more. She nodded, squeezed my arm, and slipped out quickly, leaving behind a silence heavier than her presence had been. Jacob turned back to me. Mom, is any of that true? Has Natalie said things like that to you? Before I could answer, Natalie jumped in again. This is ridiculous. I was trying to help. Your mother has been forgetful lately. She has made mistakes. She left her keys in the mailbox. She forgot to pay her gas bill. She misplaced her phone 3 times in 1 week. Someone has to get her organized. That is all. I took a slow breath. I left my keys in the mailbox once because I was carrying groceries and the bag tore. I missed a gas payment because the statement was delivered to the wrong address. And I misplaced my phone because I was helping you move furniture in your living room while you scrolled through your laptop, looking up remote jobs you said you might apply for. None of those things indicate incompetence. They indicate being human. Jacob blinked at me, his mouth parting slightly. He remembered every detail. Natalie tried to speak again, but the ground beneath her was shifting fast. The confident expression she normally wore had started to crack. Jacob ran a hand over his forehead. You never told me she said anything about assisted living. Why did you not say something? Because I wanted to understand her intentions clearly before confronting anything. I said, and because you were happy, Jacob. I did not want to pull you into conflict unless I knew you were in danger. He sank slowly into his chair as if the weight of that truth was too much. The past rose in me again, uninvited, but steady. After James died, I spent years fighting off suggestions that I should let someone else handle my life. Social workers, well-meaning neighbors, even my own sister once said I should move into some small community home because she believed a young widow could not raise a child alone. I had to prove myself every day, that I could work, that I could raise you, that I could survive. I turned toward Natalie. So when you started dropping hints about needing to manage my bills or organize my life, I recognized the pattern. It was not care. It was control. It always was. Natalie folded her arms, but her hands trembled. I was trying to help the family run smoothly. There is nothing wrong with efficiency. Efficiency does not explain taking ownership of my credit card without telling me. Efficiency does not explain telling people I was losing my memory. Efficiency does not explain pushing Jacob to move the deed of this house without letting him think through any consequences. Jacob flinched. He rubbed the back of his neck, a sign he had been overwhelmed for a long time, but never admitted it. "Was that your idea?" he asked softly, or hers. His eyes moved from me to Natalie. Natalie reacted too quickly. It was a mutual decision. "We thought it was best. Your mother seemed confused last month. She kept repeating the same story about her job at the alteration shop. That story," I said quietly, "was about the first year I had after losing James. It is the year I learned how to keep us alive. I repeated it because you asked how I learned to sew so well." You nodded, but I could tell Jacob heard the tremor beneath my voice, the tiny betrayal in turning a memory into a weakness. I walked to the end of the table, steadying myself with one hand on the polished wood. "You never cared to understand my history, Natalie. You were too busy rearranging my future." Natalie finally lost her composure. She stepped forward with her chin lifted stubbornly. "If you had handled things better, I would not have had to step in. This family needed structure, direction, someone with actual sense. I was doing what Jacob would not." Jacob looked as if she had struck him. His voice softened into something pained. "You never trusted me, or my mother. You trusted control. That is all this has ever been for you, is it not?" Natalie said nothing. I felt a calm settle inside me. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just the quiet certainty that truth, once spoken, cannot be pushed back into silence. There was a long pause, deep and heavy, and in that pause I could feel the room rearranging itself around the truth. Jacob breathed out slowly, as if waking from a long and uneasy dream. Natalie stared at me with wide eyes, realizing how quickly her confidence had eroded. I returned to my chair, resting my hand again on the parcel. For now, it stayed sealed. Its time had not yet come. I folded my napkin neatly and placed it beside my plate, letting my fingers rest there for a moment. Jacob looked at me again, softer now, almost pleading. I can see now that something has been wrong, for longer than I wanted to admit, but I still do not understand the full picture. What was she trying to take from you? What was she trying to take from us? I met his gaze. The answer would come, just not yet, because the truth he was asking for was not just about Natalie. It was about me too, and the parts of my life I had locked away for decades. Before I could speak, the room fell into another uneasy silence, the kind that marks the last few seconds before something buried rises all the way to the surface. The silence pressed in on all of us, thick and unmoving, as if the air itself was waiting for my next breath. I could feel Natalie watching me with a wary edge, her shoulders tight, her jaw clenched. Jacob sat with his hands folded together, waiting for an answer he did not yet understand how to ask. The others around the table barely breathed, unsure if this was still a family dinner or the unraveling of one. I lifted my gaze from the napkin and let my eyes settle on Jacob. "You want to understand, then you need to know how long this has been building. Not just tonight, not even just this year." His brow furrowed. "Mom, if something was happening, why did you not tell me sooner?" "Because I needed to be sure," I said, "and because I needed to protect you until I knew what I was dealing with, and I needed to protect myself." I leaned back slightly, drawing a slow breath as the memories rose, steady and sharp. After your birthday in September, I noticed something strange. I received a letter from my bank. It said I had requested a new debit card. I never did. I called them, and they assured me the request came from a device registered under my name, but I had not used any device that day. Someone had accessed my online account long enough to submit a change request. They did not get far, thankfully, but it was enough to scare me. Jacob's eyes widened. He knew where this was going, even if he did not want to admit it. I went to the branch in person. I asked them to print a list of devices that had accessed my account that month. There was one I recognized, and there was one I did not. It matched the device registered on your joint phone plan with Natalie. Natalie let out a sharp gasp. That is nonsense. I never touched your account. Never. Why would I even know your password? Because you watched me type it. Twice, I said quietly. Natalie's lips parted, but she could not deny the memory forming behind her eyes. She had stood beside me one afternoon at Jacob's house while I paid an online bill. She said she was only checking to see if the Wi-Fi was working. I knew even then something felt off in the way she leaned in slightly too close. Jacob rubbed his forehead with a trembling hand. Why would you do that, Natalie? She lifted her chin. I did not. I would never. Maybe your mother is confused. I met her eyes. That was the moment I realized this was no misunderstanding. It was intent. The room shifted. Someone at the table let out a small gasp. Jacob sat straighter, his expression darkening. I continued. I knew I could not confront her then, so I contacted someone who specializes in elder financial protection. His name is Henry Collins. He used to be a public defender in Portland. Now he works for older clients who get targeted. He told me to secure every important document I owned, every deed, every statement, every contract, and keep them off site, so I did. Natalie's face lost a shade of color. She whispered something under her breath, but no words came out clearly. Jacob looked between us, his breathing uneven. You hired a lawyer. You really thought someone was trying to hurt you. Trying to control me, I corrected gently, and control you through me. Yes, I did. I had not intended to bring Henry to the house tonight. I had planned to wait until after the holidays. But two things happened this past week. First, I received a notice from my credit union that someone had attempted to gain access to my retirement account. They did not get in, but the timing was not a coincidence. Second, and this is what forced my hand, I got a call from the county recorder's office. They told me someone had inquired about transferring the title of one of my rental properties. Assuming I had agreed to sign it over, I had not agreed to anything. Someone was preparing to forge paperwork. Jacob stared at Natalie as if she had turned into someone he did not recognize. Tell me you did not go that far. Please tell me you did not do something like that. Natalie's throat worked as she swallowed. I did not forge anything. I simply made inquiries. Anyone can ask questions. Your mother exaggerates everything. I felt a wave of heat rise in my chest. That word, exaggerates. For most of my life, whenever I spoke of something painful or real, someone would tell me I was exaggerating, that I was making too much of things. It was a subtle way to silence a woman without ever lifting a finger. I spoke calmly, but firmly. I exaggerate nothing. I learned a long time ago that no one listens to women who cry too loudly. So I stopped crying and started documenting instead. I have every call recorded, every message saved, every form requested, every date and time. Henry has them all. Natalie's eyes widened. Her confidence visibly crumbled at the edges. Jacob's voice cracked. You plan to take my mother's property, her credit card, her independence. What else? What else were you doing? Natalie stood abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. This is absurd. Your mother is manipulating you. She has been turning you against me ever since we got engaged." A hollow laugh escaped me. "If I wanted him against you, Natalie, I would have said something the very first day you suggested I should stop paying my own bills and let you take over. I stayed quiet because I wanted Jacob to be happy. I gave you the benefit of doubt longer than you ever deserved." Jacob's breathing grew heavier. He looked sick. Betrayal and disbelief fought across his face like two storms colliding. I saw the boy he used to be in that moment. The little boy who used to cling to my skirt at the grocery store because the world felt too big. The teenager who tried so hard to fit in that he let people push him around. The young man who wanted so badly to be loved that he ignored red flags waving right in front of him. He whispered, "I trusted you, Natalie. I loved you. Why would you treat my mother this way? Why would you treat me this way?" Natalie's voice rose in desperation. "Because you are weak, Jacob. Because you let everyone walk all over you. Someone had to protect our future. Someone had to take control. Your mother never knew how to handle money. She never had anything. I was trying to fix the mess she made in your life before it ruined ours." Her words landed like blows. Jacob flinched as if struck. His eyes glistened. The room grew unbearably quiet. I stepped closer to him. "Jacob, look at me." He lifted his gaze slowly, tears gathering in his eyes. I reached out and touched his hand. "You were never weak. You were gentle. There is a difference. People like Natalie confuse the two because they do not understand gentleness. They fear what they cannot control." Natalie's face twisted, and she opened her mouth to argue, but no sound came. Her voice trembled before disappearing entirely. I could see it in her eyes, the fear, the realization that this was slipping away from her, the narrative she had crafted, the control she had built piece by piece, the web she thought she had woven tightly around Jacob and me. It had taken years for her to tighten it. Tonight, one truth at a time, it was beginning to fall apart. I let go of Jacob's hand and returned to my seat. The unopened package sat in front of me still, waiting patiently for its moment. Beyond it, the candles flickered against the glossy table surface, their flames swaying in a faint draft that drifted through the room. There was more to say, much more. But the night was shifting, and I could feel the next revelation inching closer, carrying with it the weight of decades I had kept hidden. The time for silence was ending. The weight of everything I had held back for months settled over my shoulders like a heavy shawl. I let my hands rest on the edge of the table for a moment. The room was so still. It felt as if time itself was waiting for me to continue. Jacob looked stunned, frozen between anger and heartbreak. Natalie looked like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure whether to beg or to lie again. I reached for the package in front of me, the same one I had carried inside my purse for the last week, waiting for the moment when the truth would no longer be optional. My fingers brushed over the tape before I slid it aside. Inside sat a thin stack of documents, neatly clipped. Every page a piece of a life I had lived before anyone in the room existed. I set the stack on the table. "What I'm about to tell you," I said softly, "is something I've never shared with either of you. Not because it was a secret I meant to keep forever, but because I wanted to protect you both from a past that took everything from me before you were even born." Jacob swallowed. "Mom, what past?" I looked at him, the kind that shapes a woman into someone quiet enough to be dismissed and strong enough to survive it. My voice steadied. "When I was 24, I married a man named Daniel Pierce. Your father. He was charming and clever and had a way of smiling that made me think he could pull me out of the life I was trying so hard to escape. For a little while, he did. But not long after our wedding, he changed." I saw Natalie shift slightly. For the first time, she looked unsure rather than furious. I continued, He became unpredictable, controlling, quick-tempered in a way that scared me more than I wanted to admit. He decided where I went, who I saw, which relatives I was allowed to talk to. I thought it was just stress. I thought marriage was supposed to be hard. I tried to make excuses. Then one night he pushed me into a wall because dinner was late. Jacob's jaw tightened. He looked sick. I kept going, calmly. I stayed for 2 more years. I stayed because I truly believed things would change. I stayed because I was ashamed to admit I had chosen the wrong man. I stayed because I was afraid of being alone. My voice dropped lower, and then I got pregnant with you. I paused to steady the tremor in my chest. From the moment I found out, everything inside me shifted. I could live through his anger. I could even take being controlled. But I could not raise a child in that house. So I left. I packed 2 trash bags with clothes, and I walked out the front door on a cold January morning. He begged me to come back. He sent letters. I ignored every one of them. 2 months after you were born, he died in a car accident in Bend. Jacob exhaled shakily. I never knew any of that. I gave him a small nod. I know. I did not want that darkness near your life. I wanted you to grow up gentle, safe, free. Then I turned my gaze toward Natalie. That is why what you did these past months hit so deeply. When you began telling Jacob that I was confused or forgetful, when you made it sound like I was incapable of managing my own life, when you tried to pull the reins out of my hands, you were repeating patterns I left behind decades ago, patterns I swore I would never let near me again. Natalie's lips trembled. She blinked fast, her expression flickering between defensiveness and something almost like understanding. She whispered, I am not him. Maybe not, I said, but the control, the entitlement, the lies to cover your tracks, the way you speak to Jacob as if he belongs under your direction, those things are the same. Intent does not matter as much as the impact. Jacob ran a hand down his face. He stared at Natalie a long moment before speaking. You should hear how you sounded tonight. You were not trying to fix us. You were trying to run us. Natalie crossed her arms. I did what I had to do. Someone had to protect our future. Your mother did not have a future. She had nothing. I was trying to build something for us. I shook my head quietly. You were not building, you were taking. The room thickened again. No one reached for their glasses. Even the children in the living room had somehow quieted, as if sensing the storm in the dining room. I rested my palm on the papers. There is more you should know. Something I have kept even longer than my past with your father. Something that shaped how I raised you and how I survived. Natalie stiffened. Jacob leaned closer, waiting. After I left Daniel, I filed for a restraining order. It took months, and he fought it even though we were no longer together. He claimed I was hysterical, that I was unstable. Back then, it was easy for men to say things like that and be believed. When he died, the order dissolved, but the stigma did not. I was a single mother in a small Oregon town during a time when people whispered if you did not stay in your marriage. I held Jacob's gaze. The judgment followed me for years. I learned to be quiet, to keep my head down, to let people underestimate me. That habit did not go away easily. I turned toward Natalie. And then you came along. And within months of meeting me, you made comments about my house being too big for someone my age. You asked Jacob why I still handled my own bills. You called me old-fashioned. And when you thought you were being subtle, you asked him if I was lonely enough to start slipping mentally. Natalie's eyes darted away, her chin quivering. I slid another paper from the stack. This is the first notice I received when someone tried to access my savings account. And this one when someone attempted to change the mailing address on my credit union file. And this one when the county recorded an inquiry into my rental property. Jacob stared at the papers like he could not believe they were real. He breathed out slowly, pain spreading across his face. I trusted you with everything in me, he said to Natalie, and you did all this behind my back. Natalie wrapped her arms around herself. I never meant to hurt you. I just needed to know what we were working with. Your mother never talked about her finances. It scared me. We cannot start a family without stability. So I asked questions. I looked around. Maybe I crossed a line, but she acted like I was stealing from her. I met her gaze evenly. You were not asking questions. You were planning to move pieces before anyone realized the game had changed. A tremor ran through her. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to apologize, but the words tangled. I felt a twinge in my chest. A part of me knew she was not purely evil. People rarely are. They act from fear, from insecurity, from the belief that love requires control. But fear does not excuse harm, and insecurity does not excuse invasion. I leaned back in my chair again. You wanted to know the truth about me. All these years, you assumed because I worked quietly, because I lived simply, because I never showed off, that I did not have much. So let me tell you one more truth tonight, the one that will make every page on this table make sense. Jacob looked up, worried but listening. Natalie looked terrified in a way she had not been earlier. I put both hands flat on the table. I am not the vulnerable woman you thought I was. I am not someone waiting to be taken care of. After I left Daniel, I built a small business in Portland. Then I expanded it. Then I reinvested everything I earned into property, tenants, contracts, investments. I made sure that no one would ever be able to trap me again. Not a husband, not a system, not anyone. I paused, letting it settle. Jacob, you thought I lived modestly because that was all I had. Natalie believed the same. But the truth is, I chose to live that way. And everything I own is protected by legal layers most people never take the time to build. Natalie's breath hitched. Jacob stared as if he had never truly seen me before. There is a reason I am hard to move, I said, and a reason I am hard to trick. And now that you know what I carry behind the quiet life you see, you understand why I cannot and will not let anyone make decisions for me ever again. The air felt different, heavier but clearer. I gathered the papers into one stack again and slid them toward the center of the table. The truth was on the surface now, not hidden, not protected, not wrapped in silence. Outside, the wind shifted against the windows, rattling the eaves. Inside, the storm had only just begun to break. Jacob sat back slowly, his hands falling to his lap. The fire in the corner crackled, a soft sound that somehow made the silence heavier. No one spoke at first. Even the hum of conversation from the living room had faded, as if the house itself had leaned in to witness what came next. I watched Jacob's face shift through a dozen emotions: confusion, hurt, anger, a kind of dawning understanding he was fighting to accept. Natalie stared at the stack of documents like it might bite her. Her breathing was shallow, her lips parted but unable to form words. Jacob finally pushed his chair back and stood. His voice came out low. Mom, why would you hide all of that from me? I folded my hands gently in my lap. Because I wanted you to grow into a man who earned his life, not inherited it. And you did. You worked hard. You built a future you can be proud of. I never wanted you to rely on money you did not know existed. He stared at me a long moment, then looked down. His voice softened. But I could have helped you, especially after I got older, after I married, after everything. Help me how? Jacob, manage my bills for me. Move me into your basement. Hand my accounts over to your wife. You see where this was going. He flinched. He knew I was right. And that was the part that hurt him most. Natalie suddenly leaned forward, Her voice cracked. Evelyn, I did not mean to overstep. I did not know any of this. I never would have tried to move anything around or ask about your accounts if I had known you had so much. I kept my eyes on her. And that right there tells me everything. If you had known I was worth more, you would have treated me differently. You would have played a different game. That is not respect. That is opportunism. Her cheeks flushed. She pressed her hands to her forehead. I am not a bad person. Not bad, I said quietly, but reckless, and too willing to take control of things that do not belong to you. Jacob turned toward her. Did you try to access my mother's accounts? Natalie's eyes widened. Jacob, I did not touch anything. I just asked the bank what their policy is. I thought maybe she would need help one day. That was not all she had done, and she knew it. Her shoulders curled inward like someone bracing for impact. I reached for another sheet in the stack. This is the email you sent to the county auditor's office, asking whether an owner can transfer a property without showing up in person. The message is from your work account. I did not have to dig far. You left your name in the signature. Jacob's head snapped toward her. You did what? Her voice spiked, high and desperate. I was trying to see how to help you. I was trying to be a responsible wife. Your mom lives alone. She keeps everything in paper files. Someone had to think about the future. Jacob's voice broke, by going behind my back and hers, by assuming she could not handle her own life. Natalie stood suddenly, knocking her chair back a few inches. She paced in a tight circle before stopping with her hand over her mouth. Her breathing was sharp, ragged. I was scared. She whispered, I know that sounds pathetic, but I was terrified we would never get ahead, that we would struggle forever, that everything would fall on us. I thought if your mom needed help, you would take care of her first, and then we would be drowning. I panicked. Jacob stared at her with disbelief, sadness, and something deeper, a crack in the foundation he had built with her. I felt a pull of something inside me, not sympathy exactly, but recognition. Fear does strange things to people. It can twist logic, blind them, push them into choices they cannot undo. But fear does not make a person entitled to someone else's life. I stood quietly, though my knees trembled with the weight of the moment. Natalie, you were not building a safety net. You were pulling at the threads of someone else's. She collapsed back into her chair, pressing her palms into her eyes. I turned to Jacob. You deserve a partner who builds with you, not one who tears at your family to get ahead. You deserve someone who looks at your mother and sees a person, not a hurdle. And if she cannot see that, then she is not seeing you either. He sank into his chair, elbows on knees, head bowed. For years I thought you and Natalie would grow close. I thought maybe the distance was just a rocky start. But this, Mom, I do not even know who she is anymore. Natalie shook her head fiercely. That is not fair. You know me better than anyone. Do I? His voice cracked. Or have I only known the version you thought I wanted? The one who nods and smiles and quietly rearranges my entire life when I am not looking. I saw Natalie's face crumble. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I love you, Jacob. Everything I did, even the stupid parts, even the parts I messed up. I did it because I was terrified of losing you. I saw you slipping from me every time your mom called, every time she visited, every time she looked at you, like she still owned your heart. I inhaled sharply. That was the closest thing to her truth I had heard all night. Jacob lifted his head and stared at her. My mom does not own my heart. She raised me. She kept me safe. She gave me everything she had. She earned a place in my life. You tried to take it instead of finding your own. Natalie's shoulders sagged. She reached for him, but he flinched back. I stepped away from the table then. Something inside me said, this moment was theirs, not mine. I moved toward the window and let the cold December air seep through the glass and cool my thoughts. Natalie's voice trembled. "Jacob, please, I know I messed up. I know I crossed lines, but I can fix this. I can change." He let out a long breath, the kind that sounds like someone realizing they cannot go back to where they came from. "I love you," he said softly. "I probably will for a long time, but I cannot live like this anymore. I cannot build a marriage on fear and manipulation and secrets. We need space, real space, and time." Natalie blinked as if she had not heard him right. Space, as in separate. Jacob nodded, yes. Her hand covered her mouth again. Tears spilled over her fingers. She looked like someone watching their world tilt dangerously out of place. "We can talk more later tonight," Jacob said. "But not here. Not like this. We will figure out what comes next. After we breathe." Natalie swallowed hard. She wiped her eyes with the side of her hand, smearing her mascara. She looked at the table, at me, at Jacob. Then she stood. "I need air." She turned and walked toward the hallway. I listened to her footsteps on the hardwood floor. When the front door opened, a rush of cold air moved through the room before the door clicked shut behind her. Jacob leaned back, covering his face with his hands. The kind of exhaustion that settles in the bones made his shoulders droop. I walked back to him and rested a hand on his shoulder. He did not move away this time. "You did the right thing," I said softly. He nodded against his hands, but his breath hitched. "I do not feel right. I feel like the ground under me is gone." I sat beside him. That is what truth does sometimes. It shakes things loose so you can see what is left standing. We sat like that for a long moment. The dining room was quiet except for the ticking of the old clock on the mantel. I felt the shift in the house, the first settling dust after a storm. Jacob finally lowered his hands. His eyes were red, his skin pale. "Mom, I do not know what happens next." "Neither do I said gently, "but we will figure it out." He nodded and looked toward the front door. "I hope she comes back tonight. Not because I want everything to go back the way it was, but because I need to hear the rest. And I think she needs to hear the rest too." The room dimmed as the fire crackled lower. Outside, snow had begun to fall in slow, soft flakes against the dark sky. We sat there, waiting, unsure, bracing for whatever would come through the door next. Snow gathered against the porch light in a soft white halo. And for a long stretch of minutes, Jacob and I stayed exactly where we were. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. It felt like the house had finally taken a breath after hours of holding itself tight. I could hear the distant hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the faint giggles of children upstairs, but everything else pressed into a quiet so complete it almost hurt. Jacob finally straightened, rubbing the back of his neck. "I should check on her," he murmured, though his voice lacked conviction. "I should go outside and see if she is still here." I touched his arm. "Let her breathe. If she needs to come back, she will. If she needs distance, she will take it. Either way, you cannot control the pace of someone else's reckoning." He nodded slowly. His eyes drifted to the front window again. The snow had turned heavier, tapping the glass with a soft persistence. Before he could answer, a small voice came from the hallway. "Grandma." I turned. It was little Emma, my niece's daughter. Her curls stuck out in every direction, and she rubbed her eyes with both fists. "Did Santa come yet?" she asked. "Not yet, sweet girl. Go back upstairs with the others. I will tuck you in later." She nodded, then scampered away. The moment broke just enough for us to breathe again. Jacob exhaled. "Mom, how did everything get so twisted? When did life get this complicated?" "Life always gets complicated when people start hiding what scares them most," I said. "Whether it is poverty, or insecurity, or shame, the lies people tell themselves are always the ones that do the deepest damage." He stared at me thoughtfully, almost painfully. You really think she and I can fix this?" I paused. My instinct was to be gentle, but he deserved truth now more than comfort. "I think she has a lot of work to do, real work, and you have to decide whether you are willing to walk beside her while she does it, or whether you have already gone too far to meet in the middle again." Jacob rubbed his face with both hands. "I wish I had known all of this months ago." "You were not meant to know months ago," I said quietly. "You were meant to find out tonight, in the exact way it happened. Life has a strange way of arranging its own timing." He did not argue. Instead, he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor with a blank, exhausted look. Before either of us could say anything more, the front door latch clicked. Jacob's head snapped up, my breath stilled. The door opened just enough for cold air to rush in, swirling snowflakes across the threshold. Natalie stepped inside. Her hair was damp from snow. Her coat was half-buttoned, her face blotchy from crying. She shut the door behind her slowly, almost gently, as if afraid she might break something else if she moved too fast. Jacob stood. "Natalie." She nodded but did not look directly at him. Her gaze drifted toward me instead. I braced myself without meaning to. Natalie swallowed. Her voice came out small. "Evelyn, I was sitting in the car thinking about everything you said, about everything I did, and I realized something that I have not been willing to admit, not even to myself." I did not speak. I let her talk. She lowered her eyes. "I have always been afraid that people would leave me if they ever saw the truth, that if I did not take control, I would drown in whatever life handed me. I spent years pretending to be stronger than I was, smarter than I was, more successful than I was. And when I met Jacob, I felt like I finally had a chance at something real, but I was so afraid of losing him that I grabbed at everything I could, even things that were not mine." Jacob's shoulders softened a notch, though the pain in his eyes remained. Natalie wiped her cheeks with the back of her hand. "I should never have touched anything that belonged to you, Evelyn. I should never have pushed Jacob to choose between us. I should never have made you feel less than. I see that now. It just took me too long to admit it." Her voice cracked. "I'm sorry. Not for tonight, not for being embarrassed, but for every moment I treated you like you were a problem to solve instead of a person." I studied her face. She was shaking slightly, and her eyes held a rawness I had not seen from her before. Not defiance, not manipulation, something closer to surrender. Jacob stepped closer but kept a careful distance. "What do you want?" "Natalie." She inhaled through her nose. Shaky. "I want us to talk without the yelling, without the fear, without me trying to force a life you did not agree to. I want to own the things I did wrong and stop pretending I have nothing to fix. I want to start over, but only if you want to. And I want to apologize to your mother properly." She turned to me. "I know you do not owe me forgiveness, and I know I may never earn it, but I am willing to try. If you let me." The sincerity in her voice surprised me. It touched something tired inside me, something that had been holding itself rigid for too long. I nodded once, slowly, quietly. "Tonight is not the night for decisions," I said. "Tonight is the night for truth. You brought yours back inside with you. That matters." Natalie's chin trembled. "Thank you." Jacob sighed, long and heavy. "Come sit down," he said. "We need to figure out where we go from here." Natalie stepped toward the table, then hesitated. "Evelyn, may I sit next to you?" That caught me off guard. I considered it, then nodded. She took the seat slowly, folding her hands in her lap the way a child might after being scolded. Jacob sat across from us, his face conflicted but calmer. Natalie spoke again, quieter. "The truth is, I grew up in a house where no one ever had enough. Not money, not time, not affection. I learned early that if you want something secure, you have to grab it before someone else does. I hate that part of me, but I have never known another way to live." Jacob's voice softened. You do not have to grab everything. Sometimes you can just ask. She let out a shaky laugh. I am learning that. The clock ticked again. The fire popped. The house was warmer now that the door was shut. But the shift in the air came from something deeper, something opening instead of breaking. Natalie's voice steadied a little. I know you're going to need time, both of you, and space. And I am not going to push. But I want you to know that I am willing to do the work, all of it. Therapy, honesty, money counseling, whatever it takes to not destroy the people I love. Jacob shook his head slightly. You do not have to promise anything tonight. Just be honest. That is a start. Natalie nodded. Her eyes glistened, but her voice held steady now. Then here is another truth. I do not want your mother's money. I never did. I wanted security. I wanted a future. I wanted us. I just did not know how to ask for any of it without feeling like I was begging. I took a slow breath, a softer one. Natalie, I said gently, you do not have to beg for a life with someone who loves you. But you cannot take advantage of the people who came before you either. That is where you cross the line. She nodded, the words sinking into her like seeds that might finally take root. For the first time all evening, no one looked angry. No one looked ready to fight. We just sat there, three people who had finally run out of ways to hurt each other. Outside, the wind quieted, the snowfall eased. A fragile stillness settled over the room, holding itself steady just long enough for all of us to feel it take shape. Then from the kitchen doorway, someone cleared their throat. I turned, and there, half in shadow and half in the warm glow of the dining room, stood a figure I had not expected to see again tonight, someone who had gone quiet for far too long, someone whose arrival meant the next truth might be the hardest one yet. My breath caught the moment I saw him standing there. Owen lingered near the doorway, tall and thin in that familiar way of someone who had spent most of his life bending himself to fit whatever the world demanded. His gray sweater hung loose around his shoulders, and his eyes, usually warm and steady, were shadowed and tired. He looked at me first, then at Jacob, then finally at Natalie. His jaw tensed as if he had walked into a room he had rehearsed facing in his mind but never truly prepared for. Mom, he said softly, is everything all right? His voice carried something I had not heard in years. Worry, resentment, hurt, maybe all three tangled together. I stood slowly. Owen, we are all right. Things just got complicated tonight. He stepped fully into the room, closing the distance between us with a hesitant sort of caution. I had not seen him since Thanksgiving, when he left early and barely said goodbye. Now I could see the weight behind that distance. He looked older than his 34 years, older even than he had in the months after his divorce. He turned his gaze toward Jacob. What happened? Jacob glanced at me, almost asking for permission. I nodded. He rubbed the back of his neck. It is a lot to explain. Owen's expression tightened. So explain it. The tension in the room rose again, thin as a wire. Natalie straightened in her chair. Owen observed her with a mixture of confusion and suspicion, like he was trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. He shifted his stance. Did something happen between you two? Jacob shook his head. It is not just us. It is everything. It has been building for months. Owen frowned. He looked at me again. Mom, are you all right? I swallowed. Yes, sweetheart. I am all right. But there are some truths that finally came out tonight. Truths about control, about trust, about boundaries that were crossed. Owen's brow nodded. Boundaries? What boundaries? Jacob stepped in. Natalie crossed lines. She tried to. He paused, searching for the right words. She tried to get access to Mom's accounts, to her property, without telling anyone. Owen blinked, stunned. His eyes shifted to Natalie. Is that true? Natalie's shoulders curled inward. I made mistakes. I was scared. I already said that. I'm trying to fix it. He stared at her for a beat longer, then looked back at me. Mom, why did no one tell me what was going on? His voice cracked on the last words, and something inside me twisted. This was the part I had avoided, the part I had known I would eventually have to face. I took a slow breath. Owen, you were dealing with so much already. Your divorce, the custody battle, your job-changing managers. You were drowning, and I did not want to add more weight. His jaw clenched. So you kept me in the dark. You were hurting, I said gently. I wanted to protect you. He shook his head, disbelief flickering across his face. That is the problem. Mom, you protect us by keeping us out. You always have. You did it when I was in high school and Dad's side of the family kept calling. You did it when Jacob moved to Portland, and you pretended you were fine when you were barely paying the bills after the roof collapsed. And you are doing it now, again. The words landed heavier than I expected. He was not angry. He was wounded. I stepped toward him. Owen, I never wanted you to feel shut out. But that is how it feels, he said, his voice low. Like you do not trust me with the bad things, only the good ones. Jacob looked between us, surprise settling into his features. He had not known any of this either. Natalie stared down at her hands. She looked like she wanted to disappear. I reached out and touched Owen's arm. I trust you. I trust you more than you know. But trust is not the same thing as burdening someone who is already breaking. You were barely holding yourself together last year. His chin trembled. You do not get to decide that for me. The quiet ache in his voice held decades of things unsaid, things I should have seen earlier. Jacob stood beside him. Man, none of us had any idea you felt this way. Owen laughed bitterly. That is because nobody tells me anything until the world is on fire. I lowered my hand. The truth hurt, but it was truth I needed to hear. He was right. I had carried far too much alone for far too long. I had kept my sons safe at the cost of keeping them distant. I swallowed. You are right. Owen, I should have told you. I should have trusted you to handle the truth, even when life was already heavy for you. He blinked, his jaw tightening. It is not just that you did not tell me. It is that everyone here is dealing with something huge, and I walk in like a stranger. I am your son, too. A hollow silence stretched across the room. Jacob finally broke it. You are right. We should have included you. Natalie nodded, her voice barely audible. I should have told you, too. About what I did. About what I was struggling with. I thought if I told you, you would judge me. Owen stared at her with narrowed eyes. I might have, but at least I would have known the truth. The air shifted again. Not tense this time, but fragile. Like truth had cracked open something that needed air. I moved closer to him. Owen, come sit, please. He hesitated, then crossed to the table. He dropped into the chair across from me, his shoulders sagging with exhaustion. After a moment, he looked up. What exactly happened tonight? Jacob exhaled. Mom showed us parts of her life we did not know about. Big parts. Things she kept hidden for years. Owen frowned. Hidden? Why? Jacob looked at me again. Mom, do you want to tell him or should I? I lifted my chin. I will tell him. I explained everything. The years after Daniel died. The work. The properties. The investments. The reason I lived quietly. The reason I never leaned on either of them. The reason I built everything with layers of protection thick enough that no one could ever corner me again. Owen listened without interrupting. His expression moved slowly from confusion to shock to something softer, something almost like respect. When I finished, he let out a breath that trembled faintly. Mom, you built all of that alone. I nodded. Yes. And you never told us. You were children when it started. I said, and men when it grew. I wanted you both to live without fear of what I went through. I wanted you to chase your dreams, not inherit my trauma. Owen leaned back in his chair and covered his face. My mother is a secret millionaire, he whispered. Of course she is. Why not? Jacob snorted, surprised by a small laugh escaping him despite everything. Even Natalie let out a weak, startled sound. When Owen finally lowered his hands, his eyes met mine. Mom, next time life gets complicated, can you please just tell me instead of protecting me into ignorance? I reached across the table and squeezed his hand. I can do that. He nodded once, then looked around the room, absorbing everything again. So what happens now? He asked. Jacob let out a tired breath. We talk. We figure things out, slowly. Natalie nodded. I want to be honest with both of you from now on. No more pretending. No more secrets. I will do whatever it takes to fix this. Owen raised an eyebrow. You have a lot to fix. I shot him a look, gentle but firm. Owen. He sighed. Fine. I will be civil. But I'm not pretending everything is all right. Natalie nodded. I know. The room settled again, the fire dimming to soft embers. I stood. Enough truth for one night. Everyone should sleep on this. Jacob rubbed his hands together slowly. Yeah, I think we need that. Owen nodded. Natalie swallowed hard. I will stay in the guest room tonight. If that is all right. Jacob hesitated, then nodded. That is fine. We all stood. The weight of everything still heavy but no longer suffocating. As I moved toward this kitchen to put away the documents, I felt something shift in the air behind me. Not resolution, not forgiveness, but a beginning, a fragile one. Snow tapped softly at the windows again. The house felt like it was holding its breath for whatever morning would bring. Morning arrived quietly, as if the house knew not to stir anything before we were ready. Snow had stopped sometime before dawn, leaving a pale layer of stillness over the yard and the oak trees lining the street. I woke early, the way I always had, but my chest felt heavy with the weight of what the night had unraveled. I moved slowly down the hall, listening to the hush of sleeping bodies behind closed doors. I started a pot of coffee, letting the steam curl into the cold kitchen air. For a few minutes I just stood there, palms wrapped around the warm mug, breathing in the calm that came only after storms like the one we had survived. The house felt different, softer, worn through, but somehow cleaner now that the lies had been stripped away. Footsteps came from behind me, light, hesitant. Natalie entered the kitchen, her hair still damp from a shower, her eyes puffy but clearer than they had been the night before. She stopped by the counter and kept her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Thank you for letting me stay, she said quietly. I nodded. You needed a safe place to land. Last night was too much for anyone to drive home alone. She took a slow breath. I know there is a long road ahead. I know trust does not come back overnight. It rarely does, I said, but showing up is a start. She nodded again and slipped into one of the kitchen chairs, burying her hands inside her sleeves. She looked smaller in the morning light, less certain, but more honest. Before I could speak again, heavy steps came from the hallway. Jacob entered, shoulders sagging with exhaustion but eyes steadier than they had been. He grabbed a mug and sat across from her. Morning, he said softly. Morning, she answered. Their eyes met for just a moment, fragile but open, a small bridge, barely formed, but there. I let them sit with it and turned back to the stove, scrambling eggs and slicing fruit the way I always did when my boys were little. The familiar motions loosened something inside me, something that had been clenched for years. Soon Owen wandered in too. He gave a small nod to Natalie, then leaned against the counter. His expression was tired, cautious, but no longer shut down. We ate quietly together, 4 people trying to find new footing on ground that had shifted under us. Conversation came in small pieces, simple things, work, weather, plans for the rest of the day. No one pushed, no one demanded answers. It felt like the house exhaled with us. After breakfast, Jacob and Natalie went to speak privately in the living room, while Owen helped me wash dishes. He dried the plates carefully, his movements slow. Mom, he said after a moment, I meant what I said last night. I want you to talk to me, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. I touched his arm. I will. You deserve that. You always have. He looked down at the dish in his hands. I know now that you were trying to protect me, but I never want to feel like I am the last to know again. I want to be part of this family, not just someone who shows up when everything is already decided. You are part of it, I said. You always will be. I may not say it often, but you are one of the strongest men I know, and I am proud of you. His shoulders softened. He set the plate aside and hugged me, a long hug that felt like something mended inside both of us. In the living room, I could hear Jacob and Natalie speaking quietly. The tone was softer than last night, filled with pauses but not anger. I left them to it and stepped outside for fresh air. The yard was quiet, white with snow but glowing under a pale winter sun. I wrapped my shawl tighter around my shoulders and let the cold settle into my cheeks. Sometimes peace does not come in loud moments. Sometimes it arrives softly, in the stillness after the breaking. After 15 minutes, I went back inside. Jacob stood from the couch the moment he saw me. Mom, we made a decision. Natalie rose slowly beside him, fingers twisting together. We need time, Jacob said, real time. Time apart, but not as punishment, as healing. We are not ending things today. We just need space to rebuild trust instead of forcing it. I nodded. That is wise. Natalie's voice trembled. I want to earn my way back, not demand it. I want to learn who I am without pretending I am more than I am. And if Jacob decides later that he cannot walk forward with me, I will accept that too. But I will not lie again. Not to him, not to you, not to myself. For the first time since I met her, I believed her. Jacob looked at me. Mom, are you all right with this? It is your marriage, I said softly. My job is to support the truth, not dictate your path. His shoulders eased. He came to me and kissed my cheek. Thank you. Owen stepped closer too. His voice was gentler now. I am staying in town another week. We have things to talk about as a family, and I want to be here for that. The four of us stood together in the living room, not fixed, not perfect, but honest. And honesty, after everything, felt like a blessing. By afternoon, the children had woken, the noise of family slowly filling the house again. My nieces helped pack leftovers. My sister hugged me longer than usual, whispering that she loved me. The house emptied slowly until only the quiet remained again. Jacob gathered his coat. Natalie did too, though she lingered a moment before speaking. Evelyn, she said softly, thank you for not turning your back on me. I do not deserve your grace, but I am grateful for it. Grace is not about deserving, I said. It is about choosing to hope someone can grow. Her eyes glistened. I will. She stepped out into the cold. Jacob following her to the car. Owen stayed behind, helping me restore the house to its normal order. When he finally packed his things later that evening to drive back to his apartment, he hugged me tightly. We are going to be all right, he said. All of us, maybe not overnight, but eventually. I nodded, my throat thickening. Drive safe. After the house grew quiet and the last lights were turned off, I sat in my armchair by the window. Snow had begun to fall again, slow and steady. The streetlights glowed faintly against the white. I thought about everything we had been through, everything we had survived, the lies, the fear, the secrets, the breaking, and the fragile mending that followed. Sometimes family does not fall apart. Sometimes it bends until the truth forces everyone to find a new shape. Sometimes that shape is stronger. I closed my eyes and breathed in the peace that had settled over the room. I had not lost my sons. They had not lost themselves. And maybe, just maybe, Natalie had found the first real chance at becoming someone better. The future was not certain, but for the first time in a long while, it felt open. If this story touched something in you, if you have ever faced a storm inside your own home, or found your strength in a moment when everything felt like it was breaking, I would love to hear your thoughts, share your experiences, your lessons, or even your hopes in the comments. And if you want more stories like this one, stay with us. There are many more truths and many more lives to explore.